Hello and welcome to the Geeks for Social Change podcast. This episode is a recording from a talk that Geeks for Social Change gave as part of an NHS Start With People event on March the 30th, 2023. As it was originally delivered as a presentation, I'll jump in and give an audio description of each slide as they go up, or you can watch this podcast on YouTube at the link in the description. As always, a transcript of this episode is available on our website or linked in the description. My name is Anna Ash and I am a writer with Geeks for Social Change. This talk is called Everything We Want to Tell You About Your Funding Scheme but Are Afraid to Tell You Because We Can't Afford to Piss You Off, and it's delivered by Dr. Kim Foll from Geeks for Social Change and Rachel Everoa from Steam Hubs and Pubs CIC, based in the Old Abbey Tap House. There's a brief mention of suicidal ideation in the context of community resourcing and some explicit language used throughout the talk. You'll also hear briefly from the host of the session, Jamie Keddy, when responses from the live audience are solicited.
So hello. So I'm Kim. I set up a little studio called Geeks for Social Change that I think we technically started in 2016, but we really got going in about 2020, 2021. My whole thing as a human being, I guess, is I've always been a sort of community activist. I think originally, like a lot of us who sort of really grew up around sort of early noughties, and this is how I know Rach, and through like the sort of like DIY punk scenes. And then as we got older, we found what we were doing had a lot of other community benefits than that, you know? And then I also did software on the side, did a PhD, and then kind of combining all those things together is how I started this practice. So basically our practice is about trying to engage directly with community groups and their needs and sort of help work together to figure out what they need, rather than kind of more tech-led approaches, which tend to center the software itself and the product itself, the development itself. Oh yeah, and I use they, she pronouns. Hello. So that's me. Do you want to do a little intro, Rach?
Yeah, I'm Rachel Everoa. I'm the director of Steam Hubs and Pubs CIC. So we are a science-focused social enterprise, and we're based in a pub, but we do lots of different community work. So we do some youth work, we do catering, we do food, and it's because a pub is a traditional space for communities to come together, and it doesn't have the invisible boundaries. And I'm really proud to say I've worked with Kim for about 10 years on community projects in our area.
I was going to say too, just so people know, it's in Manchester in the Science Park, and if you're there, you should go in and have a pint.
A slide titled, What is Community Development Work? With the subheading, Share Your Thoughts with Us.
So I think the first question we had for everyone, because I think like one of the things we'll get into a bit later is we often find we're saying the same words and meaning completely different things. We're going to kind of open up to the room a bit. Like, what do people think of as community development work? We'd love to hear like specific examples if anyone is feeling brave, helping out and improving. Yeah.
Helping communities do more for themselves is sort of part of that, is maybe realising the limits of what the NHS and other public sector bodies can do. And actually sometimes it might mean stepping back and letting people do more for themselves is the point I was trying to get across.
Yeah.
Also, how do you define a community? Is it locally based or is it?
Yeah,
it could be nationally as well, couldn't it? If you have sort of communities of interest and
I read a few more out just for the recording too, like understanding strengths of communities, defaulting to ideas within framework of asset-based community development. Yeah, so like asset-based, strengths-based, they get used interchangeably a lot. I think we use them a lot. Supporting grassroots organizations to support their communities. Mobilizing material support and access for people already working on the issues in the community. Yeah, I think the material thing is really important. I mean, we'll get into it in a bit, but I find a lot of the time what we end up doing is we're sort of like, I guess it took a long time for me to think about what we were doing as community development, Rach. I don't know about you. So like if you're just putting on events and like doing nice things for people and like organizing stuff, and then very often we've got all these other people coming in and then their main job is to measure what we're doing or write it down or sort of just be in the meetings, right? I think this split seems to happen quite a lot, where it's like the people who sort of just like get their hands dirty and do the washing up, and the ones who are there to kind of write down and monitor. Yeah, another one. Exactly. Definitions are important. I work in a community of co-producers nationally. I'm equally aware that most people see their community as their local area.
Yeah, I think I've got an anecdote I had meetings for 2 years with this big developer. And when I was talking about the community, I meant the local community, the people from the council estates, the people who use the assets. And it took me a year and a half to realize they meant the business community. And then you can say, because it's such a loose defined word, quite often if you're talking to stakeholders, they can say, well, you haven't got enough voices from the community because it's such a vague definition.
Or I think the other one that happens a lot is there's a presumption that there isn't a community and they're going to start a new community, right?
Yeah.
So they'll say community development work, but what they mean by that is people turning up to my meeting.
Yeah. People who agree with what I want.
A slide with a Venn diagram. The circle on the left is labelled GFSC projects and has 3 items in it, which are Transdimension, I'm OK, and UntechCon. The circle on the right is labelled Old Abbey Tap House projects and has a further 3 items in it, which are Family Mealtime, Len Johnson / Breaking Bars, and Steam Radio. The intersection between the circles is unlabelled and has 3 more items in it, which are TV dinners, Place Cal, and Hume History Day.
So some of the projects we've done, so that, you know, there's a bunch the GFSC have done, there's a bunch the Old Abbey have done. We are in the same ward in Manchester too, which was kind of quite serendipitous. We didn't plan it, but it's worked out really well. So some of the ones that we've done as Geeks for Social Change, our biggest project is called Place Cal, which is in the middle. And we developed this community calendar software that's based on, rather than everyone having to log into a central thing and put all their information in, like all the kind of council and the housing association sites, we support people where they are to list events using whatever they have now. So like Google Calendar, Outlook, Facebook, might be Meetup or Eventbrite or whatever. And then our site sort of aggregates it all in one central place. And it's been a really long development process over a few years. The biggest one we just launched is called the Transdimension. And it's a listing we made with a charity called Gender Intelligence in London, and it shows all the trans events in London. But like I say, it's all completely automated. It's all like pulled in from external sources. And now it's also mapped onto a real life partnership of the groups who are actually working together, so less siloed. And it's sort of this, you know, overall strategy approach. A couple of the other ones we made a little bot called I'm OK that was support people doing signing support for asylum seekers. The way that asylum works, or sort of works a bit less now because of COVID, is there's kind of a parole system. You have to go to these horrible industrial estates in the middle of nowhere and sign in to say you still live here. But if they decide to deport you, they very frequently refuse you a call, whisk you off to the airport. So volunteers for ages were just sitting outside and marking people coming in and out. And anyway, we made a little bot to automate this kind of process that allows all that data to be controlled by the group doing it. And then finally, we do a lot of work around this bigger mission we've got. So UntechCon, we ran online last year. We're about to start the unreading group, we're calling it, because you don't have to do any reading, you can just show up. But just having these conversations about how tech isn't really serving people right now. The word we hear a lot is like, I'm not a tech person, but like everyone's spending 8 hours a day on a computer at the moment and has been probably since about 2020. I mean, a lot of people are, right? Or we're on our phone or, you know, on both at the same time. And I think a lot of the software that we use day to day has been designed to make you feel like an outsider. So we've got this situation where there's this new kind of oppression going on. And instead of it being seen as like a group thing, everyone individually feels like they're just being stupid and they don't get it. And it's kind of by design. So we're trying to start discussions around this, kind of like helping people understand and generate autonomy over what it is that they want to do and build the tools together and involve people more in it. And this is what we're trying to start with this conference series. Do you want to talk about yours, Rach?
Yeah. So one of the reasons we chose a pub to base our social enterprise in is invisible boundaries that stop people going to other spaces. And a lot of the new built community centres have those. So a lot of the work we do, so we operate as a traditional pub, but we do loads of community work on the side. And for example, Tuesday is a big day for our community work. In the first week of lockdown, we realised lots of the elderly people in the 2 estates next to us couldn't get any food because Asda was selling out. And we also realised there was a problem with information gained to people. And if you weren't tech savvy, there was a lot of miscommunication going out in our ward in Hume and a lot of rumours. So the pub, Place Cal, or Geeks for Social Change, Acorn Tenants Union and Gascoigne Project, we all came together and we knocked on all the doors, handed out leaflets and set up a food distribution. So we sent out a 2-course hot meal every Tuesday, and we're doing that since lockdown. Heritage has been really important. Our pub is the last building left of the Greenhays estate. And we do a lot around memory and people remembering the heritage of this area. One of the best projects we've ever done is to get all the old maps from the 1950s and bring a lot of elderly people who are near the end of their lives back to their old houses that don't exist anymore to show their families and tell their stories. We're also the pub where Len Johnson overturned the colour bar. Len Johnson was an absolutely amazing fighter. He probably was the best British boxer we've ever had. But he wasn't allowed to fight for Britain because he was black. And he came back to Manchester with his best friend and became a bus driver, and he did loads of activism in Manchester. And part of that was, there was a horrible point of time when there were signs in pubs in Manchester that said no blacks, no dogs, no Irish. And this pub was one of them. And Wilf, Len's best friend, told Len about the colour bar at the Abbey and asked Len to come down and order a drink. And it was extremely brave on top of the fact that Len didn't even drink alcohol. So he came down to this pub. He wasn't served by the landlady. Him and Wilf went and got a load of supporters. They went to the mayor's office. They got some press attention. And they came back a few days later and the landlady had to serve Len, and it broke the colour bars across Manchester. From the moment we found out that fact, we made a big celebration about it. We started having a moment and a drink for Len Johnson, and it built up organically. And about 2 years ago in lockdown, we managed to run one under the COVID rules. And all these young people had turned up, and they all had created poetry and rap and pictures about Len Johnson. And so we decided to give them their own night. So a lot of young people in the area have launched a night around Len Johnson, which is a grime hip hop night for specifically young Black youths to celebrate his legacy. And it's been phenomenal. And I feel that's some of the key of our work, is taking information and letting people do what they want with it. Steam Radio was another thing that came out of lockdown. We've got a cultural community around the pub. It's really active. It's a lot of people maybe wouldn't engage, don't feel like they have access to music. When lockdown happened, we didn't want to lose that community. So we set up a radio and we made some little DIY guides on how to record from home in your bedroom. And we managed to get 40 shows by people who'd never done any broadcasting, and we've kept it going since.
Yeah. And I think like the key point to all of this, right? And I think that's why it's obviously a lot of self-promotion for us in our projects. But I think the point is that like these aren't projects that we dreamt up, or like, you know, we've obviously had a big input in them, but they're projects where people came to us with a problem and we used the resources we had available to us to try and fix it. So it's very emergent, right? We're like working with people who are our neighbors, and we're working together to try and do something that's then bigger than all of us, right?
So I chose those projects too, because they're the ones I've struggled to get funding with, even though at the time the buzzwords. So in lockdown, it was emergency food support was the biggest buzzword, and everyone was trying to fund food projects.
We've had no local funding for any of this. We have
no funding for the food support, and we still send out 2-course meal every Tuesday and a hamper of food. And I'm seeing more need. And the problem with funding, the last bit of funding that came out, they wanted to fund fridges and food, but there's tons of fridges and tons of food. But what I need is funding for staff and electricity at the moment.
A slide titled "It's Time for Buzzword Bingo" with a table below it. The table has 5 columns and 4 rows, which read, left to right, storytelling, social isolation and loneliness, age-friendly, climate justice, warm banks, COVID-19 response, food poverty, suicide prevention, digital inclusion, homeless prevention, EDI/DEI, metabolic justice, social prescribing, levelling up, Northern Powerhouse, asset-based working, social impact, impact evaluation, social enterprise, and cultural communities.
I mean, we've had funding from sometimes national sources, sometimes innovation, but we've always had to go outside of our local authority, outside of our local NHS. Like we don't get any support or for any of these projects that for us are very like integral to ourselves, our lives, our communities. And it's not just that we don't get funding, it's that there's not even conversations happening around how these could be integrated with wider sort of health and social care agendas. And usually then what we get is this stuff, right? So every new fund that comes out, or there'll be a new neighborhood link worker or community navigator or whatever they want to call, or like there'll be a new housing association initiative or it'll come from the council, and all of a sudden, all right, yeah, we want to do a digital inclusion project, or we want to do a food poverty project, or we want to do a social enterprise project, or some other word that feels like it's just come off a desk as like a priority list. And then all of a sudden we have to rewrite everything we're doing in terms of that one concept. But like in reality, most of the things we do probably hit like a third of this grid, if not more.
It's hard because every year you pitch almost the same projects to tackle the same thing, which is hypercapitalism, insecure housing, insecure jobs, insecure food, and the impact that has on people's life. And yet every year you've got to figure out the new buzzword and then pitch it to the buzzword. And it's almost like an algorithm. I know that there's funders who won't read your application unless they see those words, regardless of the content of it.
Yeah, and it feels like the main thing we've got to flatter is the person who made the form, not the people we're trying to work with locally, right?
Yeah, and it makes everything very project-based. So there's an amazing community centre in North Manchester, and every 3 or 4 months they've got to come up with a new project so they keep the lights on in the community centre, and they'll get loads of funding to buy assets. So they've got loads of laptops that they've bought. The software on it, they have to pay a fee for, and that's run out. So all these laptops are absolutely pointless, and they're sat there and they can't be used by anyone because they can't find the money to pay for the software on them. And they're saying they don't have any space there. So they're constantly putting on projects and then having to get rid of this equipment to have more space to do more projects.
The device things are real. And there's even times where like we've applied for digital inclusion projects for a place car rollout, which we keep getting asked for the information that our software would produce by everyone in the neighborhood. And then when we're like, do you want to give us some money so we can do the community development work to roll it out? It's like, oh, apply to our fund for digital inclusion. Then I think last time we applied to the digital inclusion fund, we matched all their criteria perfectly. And then they just said, oh no, we've got to do homework clubs for kids now. So all this money has to go on laptops. And it was like, and you're just like, what do you want us to do here? But then I think like 2 weeks later, they were asking us again for the information that we would have been able to give them if they funded us. And it just goes round and round and round like that for years sometimes.
A slide titled, "Would your last fund have funded these projects?" The body of the slide reads, if yes, what would we have had to do to get the funds? What hoops would we have had to jump through? What reporting would we have had to do? And if no, why not?
So I think this is the key question for us. Obviously, again, we're very much a little bit self-promotion mode, but I think it's really worth, like, if you're organizing a fund or putting a fund together or starting a new initiative, just thinking through, like, what projects are there in the community already? What do you know about? Would your fund be able to have those funds? What hoops would you be making people jump through to be able to apply to them? I honestly feel like no one ever considers this question when they design a lot of these things, of just like starting from the perspective of what's already out there and what can we support, and then how can we make a thing which matches up to our institutions.
A slide which reads, our relationship with institutions and funders, it's not great. Why?
So as you're probably getting the gist for, our relationship is really not great. It's been very antagonistic for a very long time. And I think especially it's got a lot worse over the last few years. As like Rachel was saying, hypercapitalism, the public sector's just being demolished, the NHS being demolished, we all know it. It's all awful right now. And I think a lot of the time you end up in a situation where there's a lot of institutions that feel like they're critically failing, and it's really hard to engage with them meaningfully. So
a round sticker reading, due to the power funders hold, it's hard to be honest with them, appears in the middle of the slide, obscuring some of the previous text.
I think like the number one thing is just, it's really hard to be honest. Like usually when you're the one doing the work on the ground, you're the one who faces the actual problems, and you're the one who's accountable to the person who has the problem and helping them fix it. So we get very stuck in these ways where we have very clear sign of if our work's working or not, but usually the people we're working with who are funding us, they're only accountable to their boss. They're not accountable to the local community. So we're very often in this position where we're having to be like the truth teller, right? A lot of people don't want to be told the truth.
Another sticker appears, which reads, funders have no accountability.
One biggest thing I've noticed since lockdown is before, if you were a community worker for a big housing association, you were expected to be out on the ground. But since lockdowns happened, everyone's gone from work from home. And I just really don't believe you can be a community worker working on Zoom meetings all day. And that's one of the issues I've been having with some of the housing associations, is they bollock me for not going to the meetings on Zoom or online, which they do all day. And you'll get the same people going and just going to the Zoom meeting sat at home who haven't actually been out in the community. And a lot of us who are actually working on the ground, we've had to make similar cuts in our organisations because of the electricity bills and stuff. So we're doing even more than we normally do. And we get told off for not going to these meetings, which then decide how the funds are going to go. And I just don't think you can do community work from home, especially if you're from a different class of the people you're trying to serve.
Yeah, and a lot of those meetings end up being kind of, 8 community development workers all talking between themselves, and the community left ages ago.
Another sticker appears, which reads, institutions are often actively creating the harms they are funding you to fix.
And I think this is another one. So very often we're dealing with institutions who are actually causing the harms that they then sort of want us to fix benevolently without acknowledging a harm's happening. So, I mean, some really big examples of this are kind of like, NHS transphobia, which is very famously resulting in these enormous waiting list times that are resulting in high suicide rates, right? And there's obviously some reforms in the way. It's not anyone's control, but there's sort of this lack of acknowledgement that a harm is happening. And then a fund will come out and you all have to pretend like, this is so wonderful and benevolent and great. And it's actually, right, I'd rather just remove the harm than be kind of trying to go for this other thing.
On that note too, as well, I've completely gone 360 on what I think is most effective community work now. And we've been seeing more people feeling suicidal, turning up at the pub. I've had to deal with maybe 3 young men, and they're in crisis mode, and the services available when you're in crisis mode, we need a bit more than a telephone line. We need more services where people actually go out. And I had this one young man who was threatening to jump off a bridge, and I just couldn't get any agency to go out and talk to him. The police had gone out and tried, and it escalated the situation. And luckily, in my other job, I had a meeting with Shelter, and the person from Shelter went out in a personal capacity and talked this guy down from the bridge. But I just felt like in that moment, although we had all these services and prevention lines and this, there wasn't actually that person to go and stop this person jumping off a bridge, which is what we really needed. Not an advisory line, not a workshop, not a mindfulness class.
A chatbot, the worst.
Yeah, and then when I raise that with funders, they tell me I should make more professional boundaries. But I'm a pub. Maybe we direct people into these services, but it's not really what I set out to do. I didn't set out to do the emergency food, but I can't stop it now because the need's gone up. And because we have this reputation of looking out for people, people do turn up in crisis mode, and I can normally help them. But it made me so frustrated that to hear this from funders going, you need to set more professional boundaries. Like if you turned up at your workplace and open the front door and someone's there trying to kill themselves, I can't be like, I'm setting a boundary today, I need to have a cup of tea. And I think that lack of understanding of what it's actually like to be on the front line and see people in crisis is missing.
Like, yeah, people don't access services in the way that the institutions want the services to work, right? People access someone they trust, someone local, someone they care about. They talk to friends and family and local institutions and places they trust. And so they're the places that need the support putting around them to deal with this impact, right?
That's what I would say is even someone bringing up some of the numbers at Christmas, last Christmas, I bullied the council into making a flyer of all the emergency food support around Christmas because we were shutting and some of the other food banks were shutting. But having had some lived experience of what it's like when you have to ring those numbers, I now sit and ring all these numbers on leaflets to check the reaction people would get. The first number I rung, this woman was awful. She was like, nah, I don't know what you're talking about. Don't know about this emergency food. And I wish there was that level of checking. You know, if you're going to send out a leaflet, check with the organisations whose numbers you put in, check that they know how to answer the phone properly to people in need. Because if you get a negative reaction, you're not going to engage with a service again. And then it takes loads of work on the ground from people like me and support workers to get someone to that level to then engage again with that service. And that lack of understanding, lack of compassion for that gets me.
Social prescribing's been awful for this, because what's that meant in practice is more and more people are just directing people to places like us or the tap house, but there's no resource or core funding attached to it. So we've usually got people earning like 50 to double what we are just to point people at us without giving us anything. And it's just like, it doesn't feel like social prescribing. It feels like getting the community to do work for free, which doesn't feel great. And again, it's funny because we're all in this because we care about it. It's our neighbours, it's where we live. But yeah.
Another sticker appears, reading the overall time spent applying for any one fund can be vast. The stickers now almost totally cover the original slide.
And I think just to acknowledge too that a lot of these funds, the time involved in applying for them is pretty vast actually. It takes a lot of concentration. Usually the turnarounds are way too tight. Not only that, if you look at the overall amount of effort that's gone into everyone who applied to the fund, it's probably actually like a net negative to the community. And I think there's something really difficult about that that's not, again, possible for any one person to solve because obviously budgets are tight. But a lot of forms, you can tell there's been no real thought gone into what it takes to fill it out, how long it takes, what the overall impact of this is, and if there might be a better way to do it. I mean, we'll get into some suggestions later on. So I think like we're getting to right now, the funding process really feels back to front to me.
A news side which is titled, People Who Live in a Place Are the Experts in That Place. The body of the slide reads, Understand we are the ones who live here. You're just visiting and will stop caring whenever you get a new job.
Fundamentally, and I think, people have mentioned asset-based and strengths-based in the chat, so maybe we're preaching to the choir a bit here, but the people who live somewhere are the experts in that place. And not only that, but like I say, they're the ones who are accountable to like their friends, their communities, their neighbors. A lot of the time we're dealing with people, running projects as like link workers who don't even live in Manchester where we are. And they kind of will gatekeep these funds and be really difficult and obnoxious with you. And then the second it's 5 o'clock, they go home. And then I've been in weird situations where we're trying to do we did a big community project in Oldham around these tower blocks that are being demolished. And, at first glance, it looks like a great room when you've got a community day together and you're all there talking heritage. Then one by one, it's like, oh, right, yeah, so you're from the Housing Association. Oh, do you live in Oldham? No, I live in Didsbury. And it's just like, over and over again, it's like, right, so does anyone in this room actually live here? Or are we just all institutional workers talking to each other? There just seems to be a real blindness around this and a real lack of understanding about what the makeup of the people in the room is, what the power dynamics is.
A slide which is titled with a quote from Bullshit Jobs by David Graeber, which reads, The more value your job to society, the less you get paid, and yet no one listens to the most low paid. Below the quote, the slide reads, A very common experience in our line of work is being the only unpaid person in the room, and the only one actually doing the hands-on work. Often big choices are made at closed meetings during office hours by people who don't actually live in an area.
It sounds a bit like sour grapes, but actually like this, David Graeber's wrote a fantastic book on this called Bullshit Jobs. And basically really clearly makes this point about how generally the more society needs your labor, the less you're going to be paid. So what do we need the most day to day? We need people making food. We need nurses. We need healthcare. We need people changing the bins and like doing all this manual labor that no one wants to do, or like in our case, right, like doing this really like hands-on community work. So I think like for years, me and Rach had the shared experience where we would be trying to get involved in something. Like I've done a lot of like queer history stuff. You sort of start a thing and you kind of start doing it. And then it's like all the institutions, you know, academics or whoever else will catch on. They'll like set up a meeting in the day and be like, oh, we're starting a committee around this thing that you're doing. And you're like, okay, so you turn up and then there's never any interest in realizing that they're just sat there to talk and you're the one doing the work and you're the only one not being paid. And it just makes all these really weird dynamics that, again, you would think would be the first thing to talk about, like what are we trying to achieve here? Yeah, I've been in these situations where it seems like it's easier for people to get MMU to buy a lunch to cater the meeting than it is just for people to meet in the evening, so I don't have to take a day off work, right?
A slide which reads, demanding project-based work when we need core funding. This is very demoralising. If we're core funded, we can work with you on the projects. Instead, we're often having to retrospectively translate what we do into your language and do all the research to match up to your buzzwords.
I think there could be a case for giving like a community bursary to community activists, because I actually think if I'd been given like 10 grand a year to live off, most of my projects were self-funded for the first 5 or 6 years, and it's only in the last few years I figured out how to do funding bids. And actually most of the time I prefer not to get funding and be able to self-fund my projects and just do them with the community. And it's only in the last few years, the pub itself, we used to only have to take 10% grants and the rest we turned over by trading and then put back in the community. And now with the rise in operational costs, but also what I'm angry about is social enterprises get used. So in lockdown, we all stepped in, not just my social enterprise, but my friends' social enterprises, especially the food ones. Everyone stepped in to feed the community because Manchester failed so badly. Muslim families would be giving sausages and beans as their food provision. And unfortunately, they centralised the food provision in Manchester. They gave it to an academic who had never worked on the ground, and they didn't listen to any of the people who'd been working on the ground with communities for 10 years around food poverty in Manchester. And then we all had to send out meals and food. And then we got stuck sending out food to people. And the families have turned around saying they don't want to do a handout model. So they want to see payment for food. But we're seeing more and more need for food. And also what I'm most shocked about is sometimes the people who do the funding or who have got the nicer jobs, they've still got this idea that the people in need are people on benefits who are lazy. Actually, the need I'm seeing is from working families, mum and dad working and struggling to pay their bills and access food. So I wish that would be addressed a bit more.
But yeah, and I think this is the key thing, right? So we get emailed, I think both of us get emailed constantly about local projects and want us to get involved in a project or do a thing. And it's like, from the amount of contact we get, it's like, I can see you're recognizing the value we give, but that never seems to be translated into something tangible for us. It's like, it's just another hour meeting we want to go in to talk to someone who's just started a new project, and then they're promised the earth and then there's no follow-up. And it's like, can just someone just fund our time to sit in all these meetings with all these project staff that turn over 18 months at this, like, dozen institutions?
A slide which reads, this is despite the fact that we hear a lot about hard to reach communities or underrepresented communities. They're hard to reach for you, not us. Presumably you want to work with us because we already have these connections, but for some reason this is never made explicit. You can't reach people and do community development work firing off emails from home in Didsbury, sorry, not sorry. Pay us to do it.
Yeah, and I think this is what Rach was saying earlier, right? But you hear a lot about hard to reach or underrepresented communities. They're not hard to reach. You just have to go and talk to people. Like, there's a wonderful health food and herbal medicine shop on Hume High Street run by this Black woman who's like a herbalist, and she constantly gets told she's hard to reach. And it's like, I literally have a shop on the high street. Like, what do you mean I'm hard to reach? You know what I mean? Of course, you can't reach people if you want to work from home in Didsbury. And this is presumably why you want to work with us, because we're there, because we live here. There's some real sort of like, missing common sense here a bit, it feels like, right?
And on that note, I don't know if you noticed, Kim, I know you're an academic, but there's a period.
I don't work in university, so I'm not an academic. I'm being
every single academic is out in the community trying to find community groups to work with. And I didn't know that they actually get funded. They get big pots of funding for this research, but they have to connect with a community group. And often they don't tell the community group this. So someone gets paid a lot of money to engage with communities that this group's already made the networks of.
It's like, can I have your address book email, right? Like, you'll get emails just being like, can you introduce me to any of the groups? And it's like, I don't know. Why should I trust you? Again, conversations that are hard to have, right?
A slide which reads, so what can you do?
I mean, we were told to put some positive notes in. I think we were just going to moan for ages because it's quite refreshing when you feel about it. I've never put all of our moans together in one place before. It feels good.
A slide which reads, "Give us the earliest opportunity to talk to you, aka don't waste either of our time, and be an active part of the process of writing the funding application. Come visit us, work with us, let's not interact through web forms."
This is like the simplest thing, I think. And a lot of people are moving towards this. But basically, like a lot of funding, it's really just like all based around the form, right? And it's usually some crappy web form in Office, and you have to click through all the pages, and it's really poorly designed. Everyone hates it. And you always have to email and be like, can I just have the questions before I start an application? And then can we talk to anyone? And it's just like, scrap that. So I think like these two-stage application processes where step one is just some really simple eligibility to get you in a position where you can have a chat as soon as possible. That's really good because presumably like people don't want to waste their time reading. We don't want to waste our time writing. So a lot of the central ones are really bad for this. Like Innovate UK has something like a 5% success rate on their flagship fund. And honestly, that form takes like a week to fill in full time minimum. And it's just like, why are we all doing this? Why is there so much time being wasted filling in the form for this thing? I'm sure that fund costs the economy money overall just because of how much time it takes to fill in. Thing is, if you want to work with us, the conversation should revolve around how are we going to make this work? Like, what do we need to get down on paper so that we can convince my host institution to fund this, and not, here's this form, fill it in, good luck, bye.
A slide reading, "Give us core funding so we're on even footing. This requires you to identify what partners you need and take us seriously as equal partners. Could you just pay a stipend to key activists you want to work with?"
Like we said a lot now, I think just like there's one philanthropic group we work with. It's really hard to get core funding. It tends to be something you can only get after a few years of a social enterprise. There's some really big foundations like Paul Hamlin and Esme Fairburn who have very weird and specific requirements. And it's kind of like, it almost feels like you already have to be turning over, £500,000 before you can even start thinking about going to these foundations for core funding. But actually, like, you almost need it more at the start when you're trying to get going, when you're trying to get off the ground. And like that kind of DIY ethos that me and Rachel are talking about, like there's so many people who've come up through that like punk DIY scene, doing shows, putting on things like Ladyfest festivals or like queer events or just like art, through the arts and culture. And those things end up, like we say, they tick about a third of the buzzword bingo box, but no one in those circles thinks of what they're doing in terms of social enterprise. It's just not why they got into it. It's anathema. That's like the language of the man, right? And I think if there was just more of a focus on identifying these like core community institutions that are clearly reaching the people that you think are hard to reach, and just finding a way to give them core funding so then you can spend some time together to work out, I think we would be in a very different starting position that didn't feel this antagonistic from the off.
A slide which reads, "Look into participatory budgeting and the ladder of citizen participation as more equitable forms of budget distribution." There's a link to a blog post about this in the podcast description.
I think there's some real good theory around this too that no one seems to have heard of. So I can drop some blog links in the chat. I think participatory budgeting has to be the future. The current situation is it's usually like, there's an institution that has a pot. They get an employee to gatekeep the pot, usually through a form that goes to the community, but it doesn't have to be like that either. It is possible to set up a fund. And again, it's like a boards. So there's commitment there. You probably need to pay people's attendance. The best funded project work in Hume came out of this project called Age-Friendly Hume and Moss Side. And there was 4 areas in Manchester. They set up an age-friendly board in each of the 4 neighborhoods. So this was an actual resident board. But unlike all the other ones, they then gave the other half of the budget for the residents to spend on what they wanted. And the striking thing about this again was most of those projects were completely unfundable through other sources. So it would be things like, the community center needs a new hob, because of course they do. Like, what possible fund would that have come out of? But without it, like, all this other community activity can't happen. And instead, usually what happens is they just get derelict. Or like the example with computers earlier, right? There's probably about 4 computer labs in where we live. One of them is always like all the computers are off with sheets over and no one quite knows why. There's one in the library, but you need to like book and have a library card and do all that stuff. Like, they're all in various states of disrepair. And again, it's all these digital inclusion things. They just want to buy more laptops, or Chromebooks is the new solution to everything, right? And it's just like there's this lack of willingness to first figure out what your real on the ground assets are and work from there.
But there's another issue. So all the housing associations have built all these cafes with really well-stocked kitchens in loads of their buildings, but there's not the revenue for the big traders they wanted in to run the cafes. So now these cafes are sitting empty, but they're too big for a community to take over and run themselves. So you've got these state-of-the-art kitchens with about 50 grand of equipment in that no one's using, or they're saying the community can't use them because they haven't got level 2, which only costs a tenner and is a 3-hour online course, or something to do with insurance. So it's like mismanagement of assets and not allowing people who need it to use them. And then the other thing I'd say, which I find really disappointing, and I'm not into these gender issues, but I quite often you'll find loads of women doing a lot of free things in the community or running a lot of these community groups. And I never see any men until there's a paid opportunity. What does that say? And I know that a lot of women care and do a lot more roles outside of their jobs to look after people, but I feel like that's a really sad state of community development, that you only see men normally if it's a paid role.
I just reiterate this too, like the only time that trans groups get support from cis people is when there's a paid role. Oh, all of a sudden loads of people applying for that. That's interesting. But basically a lot of these small groups don't necessarily even want funding initially. These institutions are coming to the groups and expecting a thing from them and not doing it that way. So it's back to front. People aren't thinking, oh, we're a small org, we can grow, we want funding. It's that people want these groups to do project work, but they don't want to give them core funding to be able to engage in that conversation around what the project work is. And I found, I don't know about you, Rach, but I've had zero contact from any of these third sector support organizations since COVID started. And in fact, they've been just another source to me of like, here's the latest form, here's the latest initiative, here's the latest loan you can get.
I think Salford CVS is really good and Stockport CVS. And unfortunately, Manchester hasn't supported its social enterprises or charities for the last 10 years. And lots of people won't engage. I'm still a person who will engage, but a lot of the like park cafes that were given to charities, they've been treated really, really badly by the council. And there needs to be trust rebuilt.
Because I think the other thing is, like, we've now learned all this infrastructure and all these names and all these organizations, but most people don't know that. To most people in the community, they have no real idea of where these things that are being done to them are coming from. So I think, yeah, just to go through these slides then, and we can have a bit of a discussion.
A slide which reads, if you must get us to fill in forms, improve accessibility for application processes. These are very often online, don't give you questions in advance, too short turnaround, too wordy, too long, and clearly written to make the office staff's life easier, not ours.
So I think this one we've mentioned a lot, like just with forms, make them short, make them easy. Don't expect us to translate into your language. I think people often are expecting this knowledge of things like impact evaluation and research and being able to express things in terms of like institutional outcomes. That's just a whole other load of things you're expecting people to do on top of all this other stuff they're doing day to day, right? It's just not helpful. And I think it's like, at some point, the institutions have to say what it is that they want to support, and then we can write around that. But when you're trying to pitch into the void, as if we're pitching what brand of Coke, you know what I mean? It doesn't feel good.
A slide which lays out a few different points. These points are fiscal hosting versus funding application model, understanding the difference between mutual aid and charity, see Dean Spade's work, mutual aid building solidarity during this crisis and the next. How can we do good work if people aren't eating properly or have an unheated house and no internet? Understand the poverty of people responding to your fund. Solve the basic needs before expecting people to jump through more hoops. And UBI, or Universal Basic Income, would solve 90% of on-the-ground capacity problems and make our lives 100 times easier.
So just a few final thoughts on like other ways that this can go forward. I've not really looked into this a huge amount yet, but there's a model in the States that I think she's more because they don't have this sort of like professionalized middle-class infrastructure for managing grants like the VCSE thing so much there. It tends to be the really big grassroots groups that grow and get off the ground. They then become fiscal hosts for other groups around them. So they will be recognized and be given things that those groups can then distribute how they want. I think this could be a really good way to work. I would love to see the Tap House be given funding to have its own fund to give to all the projects that you're trying to get off the ground, right? Because you're in the perfect place to do it. We're the same at Geeks for Social Change. There's probably about a dozen projects at any one time that people in our collective are interested in. And how it is right now is we have to apply, we can help people apply for them all individually. But honestly, if someone just gave us a large grant, we could dedicate loads of time to helping get a dozen projects off the ground and then give them the precise support they need rather than trying to do this massive admin. This Dean Spade book, Mutual Aid Building Solidarity During This Crisis and the Next, is excellent. It's a really tiny book. It doesn't take long to read. It's on Verso. He's also got a load of reading on his website. If you want to look up Dean Spade, very recommended. I think it really sums up the difference between the mutual aid and charity models. I think this is something Rach said earlier, but again, there's sometimes you need to deal with a prerequisite step before you can deal with the latest hype thing. So like, how can we do work or do projects if people aren't eating or they're not heating their house or they don't have internet? And a lot of the times this is just directly blocking people being able to engage in any of these things we were talking about. So I think sometimes stuff gets really ahead of itself and we need to backtrack a bit. And then finally, just to say, again, this is more of a national campaign. I know none of us have the control here, but ironically, during lockdown, when we had the furlough scheme, which said that anyone who's got an office job can maintain their salary because they somehow deserve more money than other people. And we had the Kickstarter scheme that just allowed institutions just to get workers in to help out. It's amazing. You can just get things done. You just have hours to apply to problems and you don't have to think about it. And because most of this work we're doing is work people want to do anyway, they're already doing for free, but that makes it perpetually unsustainable. So if we had a universal basic income, I think that will probably have the single biggest health impact of anything else I can imagine on a policy level. I mean, I don't think Tories are ever going to do it, but there you go.
And that concludes this episode of the Geeks for Social Change podcast. Thank you very much for listening. If you'd like to find out more about what we do, head to our website, which is at gfsc.studio. You can also join our Discord community, sign up to our mailing list, or follow our blog via RSS to stay up to date. If you'd like to contribute financially to help us keep going, we're on Ko-fi and Open Collective, all of which are linked both in the podcast description and on our website. If you enjoyed this episode, do share it on social media with the hashtag #StartWithPeople and tag us at GFSC Studio on Twitter and Instagram, and at GFSC at social.gfsc.studio on the Fediverse, which includes Mastodon.